So while we're getting set up, how many people here know what an MVP means? Show of hands. Okay. So I find that the term MVP means different things to different people, so I'd like to start with the definition. So you've all probably seen this build, measure, learn loop, and you'll see it throughout the day. Some people use MVP, the term MVP, to mean any one of these things, which is fine, and that's actually a good thing. All of these things help you go around this loop as quickly as possible without overbuilding. So that's one definition. I tend to subscribe to a more strict definition. I define MVP as the smallest solution you can build, but that also has to capture customer value. And so by that definition, I don't necessarily consider those things as MVPs, but because while they might help you test parts of your business model, they don't actually deliver value to customers directly. I'm also a big proponent of capturing some of that customer value with your MVP, if possible, which is just a fancy way of saying that I believe if you intend to charge for your product, that's something you should start by testing with your MVP. And I'll get into more of that into a little bit later once I get into the case study. So with that out of the way, I'd like to jump right into the case study, which is how I built the MVP for one of my products, User Cycle. So going back in time, I was writing a blog on lean startups because I had drank the Kool-Aid. I thought these ideas were very powerful. And I was using my blog as a way to openly test and share that learning with people. Along the way, I entertained the idea of writing a book, which Eric mentioned. And as a way to test that book, I built an MVP for that book, which was workshops. I went out and taught workshops before I actually wrote the book. And I'm not going to talk about that case study here. But during the workshops, I was also talking about this homegrown system that I built, which I cobbled together using Dave McClure's startup metrics, which I'm a big fan of, cohort analysis, and automated emails, or what we call lifecycle messaging. And when I would describe the system, I would get people in the room to get very interested, very excited, and ask how they could build such a system, or how, more importantly, how they could just go out and buy such a system. And one didn't exist out there in that exact form, but that was the initial spark for User Cycle. Now, when entrepreneurs get hit by an idea, they usually fall in love with the solution, or awesome. Sometimes that awesome is truly awesome for a lot of people, but more often than not, it's not. And so what I then had to do is I had to go back and not just look at the MVP in terms of the solution I was going to go and build, but look at the entire business model, because that is the product that we entrepreneurs have to deliver at the end. So what I did at that stage is I set up a landing page. I put that out there, and I announced User Cycle on my blog. And I used that to find a number of companies that I could go talk to, and I ran formal problem interviews with them. And I talked to companies that ranged from 2 guys in the garage with no customers, all the way up to enterprises that had millions of users with them. And what I specifically wanted to learn is what were the must-have problems that those customers had, who specifically those customers were, how they were solving this problem today, and how I might identify an early adopter that would be the best place to start. Once I determined for myself that I had a problem worth solving, I then moved into the next stage, which was defining the MVP. And so the solution that I had envisioned was a combination of all these things. I was going to build something with pirate metrics, cohorts, and lifecycle messaging, and I knew how to do that already. But a key component of the solution was also making the resulting product accessible to everyone in the company. So much like we heard with Etsy, we wanted to make this available to everyone. It was not a product that was targeted just to developers and marketers, but it needed to be used by anyone, including advisors and investors. And so what I had seen from my own experience is that while concepts like cohorts are easy to understand conceptually, they're very hard to implement so that they're easy for everyone to understand. We actually make them quite complex when we implement them. And so what I wanted to do here was to test that with a demo. So we set out to build a demo, and we did this entirely in Adobe Illustrator. We didn't write a single line of code. And the key question we wanted to ask, we wanted to show this to people, and we wanted them to be able to answer this basic question, and then eventually move them down the list to be able to answer these other 2 questions about their product. And so the way we did this is we started with the basic funnel chart, we put it in front of people, and we quickly realized that when we put 2 of these charts next to each other, it was difficult to see which one was better. And so we started tweaking the charts, and we soon realized that the funnel chart itself wasn't really adding any value. The shape of the funnel chart wasn't adding any value. And so we replaced it with a much simpler bar chart. But this still assumed that people knew whether the numbers they were looking at were actually good or bad. And that's when we ran into the work into the work of a guy named Stephen Few, who invented the bullet chart. And that added two powerful features that we incorporated into our mockups. One was the use of shaded areas, which help you quickly designate areas. What we're using it for is to designate areas of bad, okay, and good numbers, so someone can look at this and see if you're actually in the good zone or not. The other thing it does is it uses a symbol marker, which we're using here to encode last month's results. And that way we don't even have to put two charts next to each other. You could just look at one chart and see if you're making progress or not. Once we had that stuff nailed down, we then began to put it together in a dashboard, and we started to show it to people, and we asked them to tell us what they were seeing in the dashboard. We went through a lot of variations this way, but the key point is that it took us days, not weeks or months, to go through this process because we weren't writing code. All this was done in Illustrator. Once we had a demo that was actually working, once people could actually look at that picture and say, yes, this is what's happening, we then went back to do more formal solution interviews. Now, the term MVP has a connotation of being embarrassingly minimal, and so the general perception is you shouldn't charge for it, you should give it away or discount it heavily. And I've tried that approach with some of my other products, and what I found with the kind of products that I'm building is that it generally leads to poorly motivated customers, and more importantly, it delays the testing of what I consider as one of the more riskier parts of the business model, which is the price or pricing. So with User Cycle, I decided to do something completely different. And we actually got our early adopters to not only give us firm commitments, but to actually want to pay for this MVP. And so I'm going to show you some of the things that we did here, and not all these things apply to all products, but hopefully you can take something out of this. So we followed a very specific interview format that we used, and those of you that might have a marketing background will recognize this acronym AIDA. The first part of the interview was really getting the customer's interest, and we did that by nailing their must-have problem, which we had conveniently figured out in the previous rounds of interviews. The next step was getting their interest, and we did that by delivering a compelling demo. And so what we did here is we demonstrated User Cycle using a real-world scenario where we would show them how they could baseline their current metrics, their current progress, and then we showed them how they might be able to identify one of those key metrics that they would need to improve. And then we walked them through a series of steps of how they might be able to use the tool to actually improve that metric. So that's how we got their interest. And the last two parts of the interview were really critical towards getting them to firmly commit to being an early adopter. So with User Cycle, rather than doing a public launch, we devised a 10x rollout plan. It was a staged rollout plan. And the reason for that wasn't so much to try to create desire or create artificial scarcity. It was really for us to be able to manage what we consider was most risky in the business model. We wanted to use a high-touch, small-scale model to be able to go and test if what we had built was any good before we thought of scaling this stuff out. But this did have the unintentional consequence of actually creating desire, which retrospectively we went back and we were able to rationalize it with terms like pricing and scarcity. And so I'll talk a little bit about what those are. So pricing is a term that Oren Klaff describes in his book, Pitch Anything, where you position yourself versus the customer as being the prize. And some of that was at work over here, simply because we had limited how many people we were taking initially. So because we were only going to be taking 10 initial customers, we had to be very careful that we were picking the right early adopters that met our profile. And so we actually gave them a lot of homework to go and do. We asked them to describe their products to us, go document their existing funnels, share their current metrics with us, and talk about what their next goals were going to be before we agreed to take them on as customers. And all of that actually ended up creating more desire. The customers actually started, or these prospects actually started suggesting prepaying for the MVP so that they would secure their spot in that early list of customers. And the next thing we wanted to test also alongside all of this was our pricing assumptions, which we had ballparked at $150 to $200 a month. Now, most of these early adopters were technical founders, and I'm a technical founder. They were also building homegrown systems. And so we knew we needed a simple way to explain pricing, because as a technical founder, we don't like to spend a lot on tools that may not deliver any value. So what we did here was explicitly anchor the price against an existing alternative that we knew they were using. And so if you want to study price anchoring at its best, I suggest you watch this short video where Steve Jobs introduced the iPad price. In that video, he spends a disproportionate amount of time talking about this price, which isn't the introductory price of iPads, but it's a carefully chosen alternative that he puts up on screen. and that is the price of netbooks. And then he conveniently goes to this next slide. There's a big explosion, and the whole crowd goes up in applause because they're happy to see that compared to netbooks, the iPad is a great steal. So we weren't quite as dramatic, but we simply used a variation of that, and we used this simple fact. And so what we would do when we would talk to these founders is we would ask them this question. We would ask them if, given their current progress with their homegrown system, which is not a core product they're building, could they actually build all the capabilities we have showed them using just half a developer a month, which is what we were trying to price the product at. And that worked with our early adopters. But in the end, what I think made the biggest difference is that we were from the start committed to solving customer problems. We weren't about building a better product for ourselves, but about helping our customers build better products. And so everything I showed you are all screenshots. This stuff wasn't quite built out yet, and people were willing to prepay. And so what we did next is we used a concierge MVP model where while we were building out the solution, we continued to deliver value on weekly calls, and we helped them understand their metrics and go through that process while we incrementally rolled out the full MVP, but that too in stages. And as we would come up with one of those metrics that they could use, we would put that in front of them and have them to start use it. And we would use the weekly calls as a way to continue to deliver value. And so this, in the end, is what I think the true essence of an MVP is. Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot.